All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody this afternoon or this evening. I'm Britton Trice with Garden District Bookshop, and it's our pleasure to welcome our two guests here tonight, Maurice Ruffin and our acclaimed author for his new publication, Connor Towne O'Neill. Welcome, Maurice and Connor. Pleasure to have
Thank
you
you.
at the books, virtually at the bookshop. It's a different ball game these days.
Good to
But
be
it's
here.
yeah,
Yeah, good to be with
thanks,
you. Thanks for
thanks.
doing this.
Yeah. So to our audience, let them know that if they have any questions for Connor or Maurice, that they can type them out in the chat room, and they will either get to those while they're talking or wait till the very end of the conversation to get those to those questions. And for those of you who have not gotten Connor's book, I've put a link in the chat room where you can click on that link, and that'll bring you to our website, and you can order copies of the book. Connor, I don't think we ever talked about getting some signed book plates or not, but if that's possible, we would love to get some signed book plates.
Yeah, definitely. We'll make that happen.
Yeah. So anyway, welcome everybody. And first of all, I'm going to introduce Maurice Carlos Ruffin. And Maurice was born and raised in New Orleans. He published his debut novel, The Southern Satire, We Cast a Shadow, in 2019. And it was a finalist for the PEN Open Book Award and longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Maurice is an assistant professor of creative writing at LSU, and he is also the 2020-2021 John and Renee Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. Maurice, welcome back to the Garden District Bookshop.
Hey, everybody. Good evening.
And it's my honor to introduce our author of note today, and that's Connor Towne O'Neill. And Connor's writing has appeared in the New York Magazine, Vulture, Slate, RBMA, and The Village Voice. And he works as a producer on the NPR podcast White Lies, which was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in audio recording. Originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he now lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and teaches at Auburn University and with the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. And this is his first book. And so congratulations, Connor, and can't wait to hear more about it. So I'm gonna turn this over to Maurice and Connor. Guys, take it away.
Hey, Maurice.
Hey, Connor. So for this first portion, my job is to stay out of the way. So I do know that you're interested in reading some of your work for the people gathered here today. So if you would like to do that, I'll just say here at the outset that we will have a formal Q&A session towards the end of the hour. So definitely get your thoughts together and save them up. And if you want to ask the questions out loud or put them in the chat, let us know, and we'll work from there. So first we'll start with Connor reading some of his book, and then we'll get to he and I talking to each other.
Yeah, so a quick setup. Back in 2015, I was in Selma, Alabama, reporting on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. It's the attack by Alabama law enforcement on nonviolent civil rights demonstrators. The attack at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge there. It was sort of one of the climax of the civil rights movement in 1965. And so 50 years later, President Obama is in town, 40,000 other people show up too. And so by the time I get there, the city is just like overcrowded with people. And I think, okay, I'm just gonna like pull into this cemetery that's a little bit out of the way of downtown, just stash my car there, walk down to the bridge, and everything will be good. And I got way more than I bargained for. There's a Confederate section of that cemetery. I have this strange encounter with a group of neo-Confederates who are about to put up a second statue of the Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the dissonance of that encounter on a day of, a civil rights anniversary, major civil rights anniversary, threw me for this loop, raised a bunch of questions about who Nathan Bedford Forrest was, what it meant to put up a monument to him in 2015. And so I just went down this rabbit hole on forest monuments. And so that's what I've been doing for, the last 5.5 years really is running down leads that I picked up in that cemetery back in Selma. I think that's probably all necessary to set this up. So I'm going to read from the first section of the book that takes place in Selma. The book's in 4 parts, 4 different cities, 4 different monuments. And this one's in Selma. So here we go. There's a story about Forrest from late in the war that I've come to think of as a parable for his life and for his memory. It's September 10th, 1864, just months before the Battle of Selma. The scene, a train depot near the Mississippi-Alabama border. Forrest is deep in thought, planning a raid. It's been almost a year since Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, recast the war as a fight to refound the Republic, and just days since Union General Sherman took Atlanta. Forrest's attempts to cut off Sherman's supply lines have proved futile. Soon, Sherman will march to the sea. The Confederate rebellion to perpetuate and expand slavery is a cause increasingly lost. Forrest had enlisted in that rebellion as a private, but by now he's a major general. He'll be promoted once more before the war's end to lieutenant general. Unlike many of the other commanders, Union and Confederate, Forrest has never been to West Point, had barely attended school at all. I never see a pen but what I think of a snake, he has famously said. So while other commanders might see to correspondence, read, or consult with advisors, the cagey, solitary Forrest walks himself into a trance to clarify his thinking. He tucks his hands behind his back, mutters to himself. His steps inscribe a circle around the squat brick station. A soldier in his cavalry spots the pacing general, and he's got grievances to air, so he approaches and begins his complaint. Without breaking stride, without winding up, without hardly even looking up, Forrest knocks the soldier unconscious with a single blow. Another of Forrest's cavalrymen looks on and describes what happens next in his journal. After the blow, Forrest keeps walking as if nothing has happened, the soldier writes, calmly and unconsciously stepping over the prostrate body each time he came around again. Each time he came around again. His monuments have a way of doing that too. I've often thought of this story while reporting in Selma, and never more frequently than when I was trying to reach the Reverend James Perkins Jr. But Reverend Perkins didn't want to talk to me about Forrest statues, at least not at first, which is understandable. You're elected as the first Black mayor in Selma, the city synonymous with Black voting rights, and less than a week after your inauguration, a group of neo-Confederates puts up a Confederate statue. And not just any Confederate statue, but one of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Then that statue is stolen, and just after another one goes up in its place, the whole country is engulfed in a debate about Confederate monuments, and some white journalist with a Pennsylvania number starts calling you. He was skeptical. My calls went to voicemail. But I figured his sense of what was at stake in these debates would be crucial, so I kept calling. I left my card in his mailbox. I spoke with his niece, and eventually Reverend Perkins called me back and heard me out. I told him I was using Forrest monuments as a way to look at race, memory, and the legacy of the war. And in doing so, I was coming to some hard truths about my country and myself. He sighed and agreed to meet for an interview. That statue, he told me before we got off the phone, was a pronouncement of war.
All right, thank you very much for reading that, Connor.
Yeah.
So we're gonna do our conversation now. And before we get into the book itself, I want to start from before the book, because the way that I first came to know you is like so many Americans, and I'm sure people here are aware of your podcast, White Lies. On a personal note, I'm going to say that I'm a big fan of podcasts in general. I probably have a problem. I listen to maybe 2 or 3 on a given day. And when I came across yours last year, I was astounded. I had never encountered anything that so quickly engaged with these questions of race and identity in America. And I thought it was fantastic work. So first question is, how does it feel to have been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize?
I mean, amazing. You know, it's still, I know I sound naive when I say this, but I do mean it as I pick the straw out of my hair. It's just incredible that your work makes it into the public and that people, and then even all the more incredible that people engage with it, feel something in it, respond to it. So yeah, I mean, writing is such lonely work. Reporting is a little bit less lonely, but just like the hours that you spend in that, like, knuckle biting, hair pulling, 11th revision of the piece state is just, that can feel like the totality of the work. So when it gets out into the world and people feel something in it, it's just amazing. And then, you know, for it to be acknowledged like that is just, I don't know. I'm kind of speechless. I'm lost for words in it. It was just a great feeling, you know. It really was.
Well, just a couple of more questions about White Lies, and then we'll get into the book. And I won't spoil it for people who have not heard the podcast, but for those of you who have heard it, you know that in the podcast, near the end of the series, is one of the biggest twists and revelations in probably the history of all podcasts. Mm-hmm. And I just was wondering, how did it feel for you as somebody who's a journalist and a reporter out there on the scene trying to get this answer that had been obscured for, you know, many decades, and you actually got some answers?
Yeah, it's, I mean, one, it's just that this is true in any story, really, any story that you're reporting, but it was like doubly or triply so true in this one, like that you just have to keep showing up. You just have to keep asking, keep, you know, putting yourself in the way of the story, kind of. And I think a lot of it in the particulars of this story, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that a lot of the sources would talk to us because we were white. Like, I think that a lot of the orientation of the work was like talking about race and squaring to this history, whether it's of the movement or of the even deeper back into the Civil War. Like, talking about race and talking with other white people about race is really like the, you know, a responsibility that white people really more white people need to take on in earnest. And so that was really a part of the motivation of the story, was that, like, there are sources here, there are secrets here that, like, because of who we are, we might have a chance of getting at. And so that's what we were trying to do. And you know, never really expecting that it would pay off, but you know, of course it did then in a big revelatory way. But yeah, I think it's, you know, it's a part of a function of, like, white people talking to other white people about race, which is a thing that we so often don't want to do. We want to avoid talking about it, so much so that we sort of pretend it doesn't exist, or sort of conflate it with the norm. You know, white identity is a norm of American life, but thinking about it more pointedly and trying to report stories that touch on that, I think is really important to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thank you for that work, because, you know, what you just said hit home. You know, my brother and best friend, Tad Bartlett, who's probably on this Zoom right now.
Is Tad here? Hey, Tad.
Yeah, I'm sure he's here somewhere. So we had visited Selma a few years ago, and I remember talking to people who were doing our own reporting project. And I remember having this feeling of, you know, what sorts of things will people not tell me because I'm African American, you know, versus what might they tell Tad, for example. And we sort of discussed that. And I just think that one of the lessons I think your work proved in that podcast is that it is incumbent upon people who are white to engage with these questions, you know, very directly, and not be afraid to just have conversations about it, because, you know, there are things that you can uncover that some others cannot uncover. My last question on the podcast is, are you going to continue along this line with your future work, more podcasts, more books, or are you going somewhere else next with that?
Oh man. That's the question right now. I hope to keep doing both. I mean, from like a from a reporting point of view, it can be, it's pretty similar work. Like, it's just shoe leather, you know, hitting the ground, finding people, trying to get them to talk to you. One of the great things about reporting in audio, though, is that you get to bring in people's voices. And that was one of the real pleasures of reporting in Selma too, and in Marion, where there are just like those voices, especially folks in Marion who are so crucial to that part of the voting rights movement, who had, like, you know, the way that sort of like more rural Black Belt accent is so amazing, and being able to include their voices in the show was really powerful. So yeah, I want to keep doing both. I love writing books. I really enjoyed the process of writing the book, but writing for the podcast is fun too, and a challenge, because the way that you write for the voice is so different. Because when you're reading, of course, you can go slower, you can go fast, you can reread that paragraph, you can pause. So you don't have that luxury when you're listening to a podcast. Like you have to nail it, especially when you want to get into big ideas or descriptions or something. Like you have to figure out a way that you can be direct and straightforward, not too many like subordinate clauses, not to get all like grammar nerd too early in the night, but like just the way you're structuring your sentences changes so much, and to try and make it still be lyrical and powerful and if you'll let me say something like literary, it's just it's a fun challenge of writing. So yeah, I want to keep doing podcasts. I want to keep writing books. It's a question of stories right now. I'm in like story gathering mode, trying to find the next thing. But hopefully I'll keep working in both forms.
Well, in this book, I really appreciate that you talk a lot about Nathan Bedford Forrest. And, it's interesting to me because I think most Americans have some connection either to him or somebody like him in America's past. I've been doing some genealogy research, and I might actually be related to the guy who fired the first shot at Fort Sumter. I haven't proven it yet, but I'm sort of along that path right now. And with somebody like Forrest, for example, I think the first time I actually heard his name was watching Forrest Gump, the film, and they mentioned like his great grandfather was that guy. But I was so young. I was like, what is this guy on the horse with the, and right? And of course, I think in some sense he's also alluded to in films like the original Birth of a Nation, for example. He's sort of like a specter in the background of the entire story. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk to us about, how did you pick him as one of your central focuses? How did you decide to sort of follow him along as a sort of character in history, if you will?
Yeah. It was really at first like a just totally coincidental, being in Selma on that anniversary. That it was a statue of Forrest that those folks in the graveyard were getting ready to pick up or to put up. And I was like you, like when I met them and they were telling me this long story of, the 2 decades they've spent in Selma fighting about this statue of Forrest, I was mostly thinking like, Forrest, like the Tom Hanks guy, what? But so, I kind of left the cemetery that day kind of scratching my head. But the more I looked into him, the more I realized that he would be a really fascinating character to trace through, not just his life and the story of leading up to the Civil War and the aftermath of the war, but really then the way that he gets remembered after the war. And you can tell a really interesting story about the 20th century too. So he's born in 1821, and his early life kind of moves west as like more and more land opens up after the Trail of Tears. He winds up in Memphis as a slave trader, and this is at a moment in like the 1840s, 1850s, where the transatlantic slave trade had been made illegal. But so there's what's called the Second Middle Passage, where enslaved people from the Upper South are moving, like 1 million enslaved people are moved from the Upper South down into the recently opened up plantations of the Deep South. And he's like the pivot point there in Memphis. He is, making millions of dollars in today's terms, becomes by some counts one of the richest men in the South at the time. And so his life is hitting on all of these like flashpoints leading up to the war. He enlists in the war. He's so rich, he equips his own troop, his own cavalry troop during the war, but enlists as a private. So, he's different from someone like Lee, who had been to West Point and is this Southern gentleman. Forrest is like the self-made man. Of course, his fortune comes from human trafficking, but we like to think of that as being a self-made man. And so he's promoted. He's the most promoted soldier of the war, North or South, becomes a lieutenant general. But he fights in the Western theater of the war and is sort of overlooked for a lot of the war. And that becomes a real sticking point in how he gets remembered. He kind of becomes like the Confederate counterfactual, like, oh, if only we had promoted Forrest sooner. If only we had seen his genius. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, has to sort of apologize for not promoting Forrest sooner. So he's the sort of like, the South will rise again, folks. Think about Forrest as like the guy that could do it. Like Lee got his shot and failed, but if Forrest had gotten his shot, then the South might have won. So that's at work in how he gets remembered, and he has this like sort of sharper edge, a little bit more violent, more masculine, less refined than Lee. So yeah, he's this like sort of everyman, but also a Superman in how he gets remembered. And by the 1990s, he's selling every one shirt of Lee, there are 5 shirts sold of Forrest. So he's become like a rising star as of the sort of like folks who want to fight the Civil War again. So really interesting figure to look at. There are more markers of him in Tennessee than the state's 3 presidents combined. There's a county in Mississippi, there's a city in Arkansas, there's a state park in Tennessee, and there are all these goddamn monuments. So a lot of that lent itself to a book like this, where you could look at his life and tell the story of slavery, but also the massive wealth that was stolen in that system. You could tell the story of the Trail of Tears. You could tell the story of the Klan and Reconstruction, and then you could tell the story through him of neo-Confederates wanting to keep this war going. I call it the sort of cold Civil War, like refight it in different ways, long after the actual military conflict ends. So he was really kind of, even if though it was a coincidence that I found him, he was a really interesting figure to tell this much longer story of the war and its memory.
Yeah, that point you made about there being more monuments to him than 3 people who are actually presidents from that state of Tennessee is so interesting to me. And even just before we came on this call today, I was reading an article about this fraternity, Kappa Alpha, and they look towards Robert E. Lee as like their founding father. They have like, fraternal literature about how he's the greatest gentleman of, the 19th century. He was the like sort of last knight, if you will. And, right now I'm here in Oxford, Mississippi, and I often go on campus, and I wasn't even aware that there was a Confederate cemetery on campus until maybe 4 days ago. And there was a family out there. It was, a dad, a mom, and 2 kids, teenagers. And, in the past, I'll just walk up to somebody and say, hey, what is this? Why are you here? Can you talk about it? And often they will talk about it, but I let them alone that day. But I jogged back out this morning and got close to it and had a look at it. And, there's this big plaque, and it was talking about the men who had fought and died, and how this was dedicated by their sons. One thing that I did with my writing, as an African-American man who wrote a novel that is very much anti-racist, anti-slavery, anti-human trafficking, I try and get into the minds of people like Forrest, just to see what were they thinking. And so can you talk to us about these people who have made it a point to sort of look back at him and his legacy and see it as this great thing? And why is there such a divide in the nation between people saying, no, it wasn't a great thing. This guy was a human trafficker versus this guy was great. He was a great fighter. We love him so much.
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think some of those monuments, like the one that's on campus there in Oxford, really get at the real divide there. So of course there are monuments to individuals like Forrest or Lee that are meant to kind of enshrine these individuals. But then the ones that are everywhere in courthouse squares, college campuses, are the ones to the Confederate dead, which you think sound a little bit more anodyne, right? Like, oh, there was a soldier, he was from this place, he died, we're honoring our dead. But really, there was this in the moment after the war. David Blight, the great historian of the Civil War, talks about how America had two major tasks in Reconstruction. The one was the full investment of citizenship to the formerly enslaved, right? 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, equal protection under the law, voting rights, and to really transform the country from a slave society into a multiracial democracy. The second one was the reunification of white Americans, North and South. And those two things were always going to be mutually exclusive, just given the moment and given the tensions at the heart of American life. You weren't going to get both. And so Reconstruction gets undermined, ex-Confederates return to power, and the North sort of goes along with it, but the country is reunified. And so the way that the war gets remembered then is not about slavery and not about the ways that the modern economy, North and South, was built on that slave system, and not about the physical and spiritual torture of the enslaved people. All of that gets sidestepped, and it's about the brave soldier and the sacrifice that they made. That mostly slavery was a benign system, masters were good, the enslaved people were happy. I mean, just this ridiculous magical thinking that becomes the sort of received wisdom of the war. We're just honoring our dead. It was a tragedy, brother against brother, but there's no lasting injury here. There's nothing to account for. This is just our heritage. But if you look at the documents of secession, if you look at what Confederate President Jefferson Davis was saying, Vice President Alexander H. Stephens was saying, basically, like, this, to anyone who would listen, this is about slavery, and we're justifying, and more perniciously, and the lasting consequence of that is we're justifying slavery on this lie that the people we're enslaving are inherently inferior than us. So even though you get the 13th Amendment and you abolish slavery, that lie about white supremacy and Black inferiority persists. So yeah, these statues, especially the ones to the Confederate dead, are about this, another one of these lies that we tell ourselves, and that we're not squaring up to the history, the central tensions of the country that made the war happen, and that persisted long after the war ended because we didn't square up to them. So I think that's part of how Forrest gets remembered too. It's like, oh, he was a self-made man. He was this military savant. At least that's what they say in public. I think in private, it's no coincidence that there are all these statues of the guy that was the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. But at least publicly, there's this sort of plausible deniability that because we have such faulty memories of the war and the meaning of the war, people can say in public, like, oh, it's heritage, not hate. Or, oh, Forrest was a great military tactician. It's just a way that, like, a sort of coping mechanism that white Americans have developed for not thinking about, like, the terrifying facts of our history. And maybe more pertinently, like, the fact that history might have a claim on us in the present, and might be, ask us to give something up, or that we had, gotten it through ill-gotten means. So yeah, I mean, it's magical thinking, but magical thinking with massive consequences.
Yeah, the point you made about how faulty our memories are, that makes me think about education first and foremost. And I know your book just came out pretty recently, but do you have any sense of how your book will be received in colleges or in high schools? Because it seems to me like a big reason why that plausible deniability is possible is because if you go through school, and I always think, for example, you could go to school in America your entire life. You can go to middle school, high school, to a great college. You go to Harvard, Yale, and you don't get a lot of this history at all. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible to, like, pay a lot of money to get that degree and just not have any clear sense of what's real and what's not real. And this is before the fake news era. This goes on for over a century. So I'm just wondering, like, do you think your book will be received as, oh, we can read this and talk about this or think about this, or to be, no, this is Texas, for example, or this is Georgia, for example. We're not going to have this book as part of the curriculum because it's just causing trouble and making us look bad.
Yeah, I hope so. I definitely hope so. Alice Randall, the great Alice Randall, I was on a panel with her a couple weeks ago, and she wrote The Wind Done Gone, this great sort of remix of Gone with the Wind, and this sort of revisionist opening up the perspectives of how you might think about the story of Gone with the Wind. She told me that she's going to teach the book in her class in the spring, which is incredible and exciting. So it's making some inroads. I was talking with an English teacher at my old high school, who says that she wants to teach it, which is really cool to think about too, because I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I got the same sort of states' rights stuff too, and I think it's compounded too in the North, because we like to tell ourselves that, like, this is a history that's down there, and, like, race, insofar as it's still a problem in America, is a problem down there. Robert Penn Warren called it the treasury of virtue, like this sense that, like, oh, because we're affiliated with the Union, we're good. This history has no claim on us. Yeah, so I hope so. I mean, I hope it makes its way in, because we really do, you know, in so many points. The civil, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the Civil War, and I think that that's like the real massive one that we need to square up to and tell the truth about it in a more honest way. But also like the colonial roots of Europeans being on this continent. You know, in so many different facets of American life, there's a lot of truth telling to be done. And I think in all of them, the deeper thing that I hope we can address in schools is that like we are not owed, we have no reasonable expectation for a happy history. Like I think we have this sort of naive expectation that our history has to flatter us, and especially Civil War history has to flatter us. And that's just not this, that's nice, and it can be, you know, intoxicating almost to think that like we can look to the past and only see good things in it. But we have no reasonable expectation of that. And if we were able to find a way to look backwards, not in a way that's meant to console us, but instead to show us how we've wound up here and give us a sort of map for understanding the good things about the present, but also the inequities of the present, the lasting injuries that we're bringing into the present, what we've inherited. I think we'd be a lot closer to being able to address these issues and these inequities. You know, we love to inherit the good stuff. You know, we inherit a house, we inherit a car, we inherit some money. But the idea that we might inherit, you know, some injury from the past that we should be responsible for is untenable for us. And so I think if we're able to tell the truth at an early age, especially if we're able to tell the truth about the Civil War and get at that deeper idea of what we think the use of history is in the present, I don't know, maybe we'd be better off.
Well, let's talk about the monuments in particular, because, you know, it seems like, and this is my amateur understanding of the monuments, is that, you know, a good number of them came up in that period during, or just after Reconstruction. Then there was this period from like the early 1900s to like the 1950s, a whole bunch came up. And then it almost sort of plateaued for a long time. Then there was these struggles that were going on, people trying to get them taken down for decades with almost no success anywhere. Then, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, 1 or 2 went down. Where I'm from in New Orleans, we took ours down, the Robert E. Lee statue that was in our circle. We saw some go down in other places. And then this year, this sort of wave of statues going down. And even it being the point where it's not just like, you know, the city council or the police jury or the aldermen got together and decided to take it down. People of their own accord just going out there and taking a rope and yanking it down. You know, what in your opinion has happened recently to cause this sort of reversal of the veneration and protection for these monuments?
Yeah. There were those two big peaks, you know, post Reconstruction and then during the movement in the middle of the century, which tells you everything you need to know about the purposes they're serving and who their intended audience is. But yeah, there has been this growing movement over the past couple of years. I mean, I think it starts, the inciting incident is you know, Dylan Roof murdering 9 parishioners of Emmanuel AME in Charleston, and because soon after he's with the explicit intent of starting a race war. Soon after he's arrested, the images from his blog start to circulate, and it's clear that almost to kind of steel himself for that act of terrorism, he had done this for around South Carolina, visiting slave memorials, plantations, Civil War sites, you know, Confederate statues. And that brought a bunch of attention to them. Bree Newsom scales the flagpole at the South Carolina Capitol to remove the Confederate flag that had flown there since the movement. And I think that was a real inciting incident for a lot of people. In some of the stories that I cover in the book, they point directly at Bree Newsom and say, like, she inspired me. I started this work. That was true at, you know, on campus at MTSU, Middle Tennessee State, where I cover a story, and it really renewed efforts in Memphis to try and get the statue of Forrest down there. And so you see over the years since the summer of 2015, which is the sort of inciting incident for the book too. Once those campaigns started happening, I started following them and started doing the reporting that would become this book. And for a couple years, I think you see a lot of movements trying to sort of proceed as the way allows, like follow the prescribed route to get these down, appealing to city councils or state legislatures or university presidents, whoever it may be. And some of that worked, like in New Orleans when those statues came down. Mayor Landreau at the time gave, I think, a pretty incredible and moving speech about the history that those represented and his path to really coming to terms with that. But of course, there was a backlash to that too, right? Like I was monitoring some neo-Confederate message boards and social media accounts after that, and they were really pointing to those removals as like, see, I told you, if we let multiculturalism win, white people are under threat. And this is the sort of, this is the canary in the coal mine. They're taking our statues, now they're going to come for us. And so that paranoia, that sort of white supremacist paranoia kicks in, and they start consolidating, organizing more. And that's what's going to lead to Unite the Right just a few months after New Orleans takes down those statues. And then, of course, there's a renewed call in the aftermath of Unite the Right to take down more statues. Like you say, a couple of them come down. There's not a mass removal, but then this summer there is, and I think we're seeing the realization of years of movement work, of organizing, of campaigning, of grassroots efforts to get more people to think about, one, just to see that those statues are there. Like I think we'd sort of become habituated to that. Some people have become sort of habituated to them and stopped seeing them. So one, just to see them and to understand what they represented, and as symbols for the deeper systems of racial inequity that persist. And so by this point, people are done asking. They're just going, and we get the really pretty incredible and powerful images that we've gotten this summer, whether that's tagging the Lee statue in Richmond and projecting George Floyd's face onto it. In Birmingham, people pulled a truck up to this big obelisk and put a chain around it, and we're trying to topple it that way. In this small town in Virginia, people are coming at it with paint, with flamethrowers, with tire irons, just bashing these to bits. And I think there's a real power in that. I mean, it's one thing. It's important for cities to officially say, this is wrong and we're going to take it down. But the sort of organic uprising of the people saying, we have had it and we're done asking and this thing is going right now. I think there's a real power in that.
Well, this question is definitely related, but it's a little bit different from the previous questions. And I guess it's political because you did a lot of close research on what America was going through in the Civil War era, where these statues were being placed up afterwards in the post-Reconstruction era. What I'm trying to say is when I think about America, I think about us as being one of the most diverse countries in the world, and that causes a lot of internal division. I think for most of our history, that level of division is like 50% to 70%, give or take. It's not too bad, but then sometimes it bubbles up. And clearly the Civil War is the great bubbling up. It got over 100%. It frothed over the edges of the container, and it went everywhere. How do you see us as a society right now in comparison to that time, where we have people saying take these statues down, the president saying no, you can't do it. Let's rename some of these military bases that were named after the Confederates. He says don't do it. You see people who are going to protest on both sides armed, and you just see this churning, and people even threatening retaliation regardless of who wins the election on the 3rd. How do you see us as a culture right now?
Yeah, bubbling. That's a great image for it, bubbling over, and just so much resentment. So, and I think a feeling among some white Americans, like a certain amount of entitlement that they had is being taken away from them. That people are sort of hopping the line, as it were, whether that's people of color and or immigrants coming and getting, the social safety net, or, whether that's, equal opportunity stuff. I think there's this long, and that's been true for decades, this sort of long standing resentment of feeling like this is a white country and white people are owed a certain amount. And any policy that's meant to address the long-standing inequities that have buoyed white people and try and make it more equitable for people who have been disenfranchised, marginalized, often violently so. Any move in the direction to try and square that is seen as taking away what's rightfully a white person's. And now we have a politician, a president who speaks that language and understands that grievance and knows how to tap into that grievance. And it's made it really combustible. I think in some ways you can read the Unite the Right rally as a lot of white folks finally just being willing to say the quiet part loud. Like, I think this is my country, and I won't be replaced, right? This is mine. And they have to ask for it now because there have been modest gains to try and address this lasting harm, these lasting inequities. But as soon as those happen, there's a backlash. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't want to try and predict the future. But I think, based on this summer and the violence that's happened this summer, it's hard to imagine what could calm things. I don't know. What do you think? I know you think about this a lot, and you write about this, and I feel like your book's only a year old, but I feel like we're sort of living in the future that you were thinking about, and we cast a shadow. What do you see when you look to the future right now?
Yeah, the way I look at it is that let's say the worst case scenario is we get into our second civil war. Some people have posited that we're in like a cold civil war where we've been fighting it for decades as part of the culture wars and that sort of thing. I think of it as if these difficult times we're going in, I use a lot of metaphors, so excuse me, but it's like we're on a roller coaster and we're in the downward part. And the question is, are we at the bottom of that dip? Or are we still a long way from the bottom? And so I think it's impossible to answer if something happens. And I do have a feeling that whoever wins is going to be another shift in this entire scenario, because I think a lot of things that happened in the past 4 years would not have happened if we didn't have the current president, for example. I still sometimes dream of that alternate reality where Al Gore actually went to the White House instead of W, for example, and what that might have been like. But of course, we only get the reality that we actually live in ourselves. So yeah, that's how I think about it. But I do want to reserve some time for questions from the audience. And what I recommend is that if you want to ask a question out loud, use the reaction button at the bottom. Just put the smiley face or the hand up so I can see you out there. But we do have a question in the chat that I want to give to Connor. This is from Chrissy. And Chrissy's question is, where do you start to research our current city's history? I'm not from the place I live in. I'm a Northerner living in the South, and would love to be a part of the conversation here in an educated way.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think this is hard now because, we can't go anywhere, but really just kind of walking around and looking at the landscape and looking out for those blue markers or those statues. Not because they'll tell a full story of the history, or you'll get everything, or you should believe everything you read on them, but because they will sort of orient you to the values of the place, right? Like these monuments, these markers aren't history in and of themselves, but they reflect a set of values about who should be, who we want to remember. So just like a walking tour, take in names, who are streets named after, who are buildings named after, looking them up, and talking to folks at the library. I cannot tell you, in every city I went to, my first friends and my best friends were the librarians at the city or county libraries, because they're the repositories of a lot of that knowledge and can point you to the right places to find more information about it. And often, more than anything, they'll point you to books and stuff to look at too, but they will also point you to people to talk to. I think in any place there are these, there are older folks who are the sort of keeper of the secrets, and not secrets, just keepers of the history, that are incredible to talk to, and love having people to talk to, honestly, because I think fewer and fewer people are seeking them out lately. But yeah, I think I think those are two great places to start. And again, pandemic makes that tough, but I think it's still doable now, over the phone or online.
Great. We'll take a few more questions. Again, we can use the chat or you can do the reaction button. But here's a reminder, do make sure that you order a copy of Connor's book. And just if you're not clear, the title of it is Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy by Connor. All right, so the second question in the chat here is, do you think existing monuments can be used to educate the public? And that's from Susan.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's tricky because obviously, monuments aren't about history, monuments are about honor. But context does matter. So if you have a 30-foot bronze equestrian statue of Forrest in a downtown park, like, you're not really saying much about history. You're saying something about the present and who you want to immortalize and bring into the present. But they can be, I realize I'm also saying this as someone who got a crash course in a sort of revisionist history, revisionist in a good way, revisionist history of America by studying some monuments. So I think they can, if you dig deep and you don't take things at face value, I think they can communicate a lot of important information. And that's, I think, a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now. It's like, what do we do with these things if they come down? Can we recontextualize them? Do they work in museums? Can we put up more signage to try and put more context around what this is? That Middle Tennessee State, the university that has a building named after Forrest Hall, tried to get the name changed. That was denied through an arcane series of state laws in Tennessee that are jokingly referred to as the Nathan Bedford Forrest Protection Act. But so because they can't change the name, now they're thinking, all right, we're going to put up some more signage around the building to really tell the truth about what happened in 1958, 4 years after Brown v. Board, 4 years before the school integrated, that led us to name this building Forrest Hall. So I think that kind of project can be interesting. I'm really curious to see what they actually say on those plaques, how much truth they'll tell. But yeah, I mean, they're tricky because they require a lot of context, and like I said, there's a real power, and maybe it's a kind of perverse pleasure, but I do take some pleasure in seeing people just like bash them in. So I don't know. I mean, I think, I think the people in the place where they are should be able to make the decisions about what happens to them. But of course, that's a fraught process too. But yeah, I mean, I think there can be added context, and that added context is super important because we do have to revise so much of the story.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer about the people in the place. And the way I think about it personally sometimes is that it's like, imagine you get married and your partner, your husband, whoever tells you that there's a statue right up the road to the person who shot your dad, and they're like, I don't want to see that there anymore. And are you going to go, but still, it's important in history and people really like it and it's aesthetically pleasing. I think at that point, that's where the sort of connection is missed between different parts of our communities, where people are saying this thing is horrible to us. It makes us feel terrible. And you're like, but the soldiers who died 170 years ago. We have another question here from, let's see, we have, where did the titles of your book come from?
Oh, yeah. I have a long answer to that. So reporting in 4 different cities over the past couple of years meant a lot of driving time. And if you're like me, when you're driving, especially at night, you get into a kind of fugue state where things just kind of start bubbling up and thoughts are bouncing into each other. So the title just kind of popped into my head during one of those long drives back from Tennessee. And so it sort of piecemeal. That devil is what General Sherman referred to, what he called Forrest, that devil Forrest. And this idea that came out of a student letter to the editor at Middle Tennessee State back in the 60s. They've been fighting over forest and how to remember forest for half a century on that campus. And back in the 60s, there was a letter to the editor from a student that was saying, we should have the good sense to let forest memory to stay buried along with his bones. So I thought that was a really nice phrase. So I had along with his bones kind of rattling in my head, and one late night drive, that devil kind of crashed in there, and we got the title. So that's a long way of saying it's a kind of nonsense title, but I like long titles. So there it is.
All right, I think we have time for one final question. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask Connor? So I have a question that's been in the back of my head since the start of this conversation. You read a section from the book that was very evocative of your sort of travels while you were putting the book together. Is there anybody or any situation that sort of stands out in your mind as being particularly important to you or enjoyable or enlightening to you in your journey of writing the book?
I think the conversations that I had with Reverend Perkins, the first mayor of Selma, were really important because I think it was one of those moments where the reporting of the book taught me a lot about how to write it, how to position myself in it. I think early on, when I was first researching it and reporting it, I really did conceive of this book as a much more detached, sort of third person kind of approach. I wasn't from the South. I wasn't involved. I'm a journalist. I'm not an activist. I'm not involved in any of these campaigns. I can just sort of cover them in the, you can't really use this word without scare quotes anymore, but in like an objective way. But trying to get Reverend Perkins to talk to me and him being really skeptical of me was really enlightening, because I think basically like Reverend Perkins wasn't going to talk to me about what it meant for him that a statue of forest went up in his first week in office until I could talk about what it meant to me that statue went up in his first week in office. That basically, I think he wanted to know that I understood that I had a stake in this too, that I wasn't just sort of parachuting in, looking at this like this spectacle of a story, first Black mayor, first Grand Wizard of the Klan, and just kind of gonna take this story and run with it. But that I understood that as a white person, this impacted me too. Like I think we have a way of thinking about race as a problem for Black people and for Black people to solve. But there were encounters like that made me realize, no, like I have a stake in this too, and I need to think about how I'm positioned and see how Forrest's legacy has shaped my life too. Even though I want to absent myself from that conversation, I was going to have to get closer to it. So versions of that I think played out in a lot of the reporting. Also, just like trying to get neo-Confederates to talk to me and seeing how they were really trying to court me and recruit me. One called me a proud Confederate, grabbed my hand and called me a proud Confederate soldier, and just realizing like that they saw that I could have a common stake with them, and that really prompted me to interrogate like what about my life had been shaped by race and by the white supremacist policies of the country, even though I had grown up so far from Selma. So yeah, I think just getting like reporting taught me how to orient myself to this material and to the country really in a really important way. But that encounter with Reverend Perkins stands out the most.
Well, thank you, Connor. And I see a note from Chrissy earlier. She just said, thank you so much for your time and your work. She's ready to hit the streets and do her own research and her own project. I feel energized also by it. I think that we can expect much more fantastic work from you. And I should ask the final question. Are you working on something right now?
The very beginnings of a project. I don't know how you are, Maurice, but I'm a little superstitious about talking about stuff in its early stages. But yeah, I'm working on another project, or starting to work on another project that makes the same move, trying to pull some deep past and see how it's still with us in the present. This one's a little bit closer to home, but yeah, it's another one of these long, deep historical dives. So I've got a lot of research ahead of me, but I'm working on something.
Well, good luck with it. And again, the link to Connor's book is in the chat. Be sure to order it for yourself or for a gift for somebody for Christmas. My book's link is also in there. Thank you very much, Britton, for putting that in there for us.
Yeah, get Maurice's book. It's amazing.
Well, thank you all very much for being here today.
Oh, thanks, Maurice. I really enjoyed talking to you, man. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you both. It's been an enlightening evening, and Connor, really look forward to for what you have coming up, and look forward to selling lots of your books. And Maurice, we've already sold a lot of yours, but we look forward to selling a lot more.
That's awesome. Thanks so much,
So
Brendan.
thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thanks again for such an enlightening evening.
Good night.
Cheers. Good night. Thanks again.
Good night all.